my dear students. Today we are looking at the paper 314 by E by A, which, as you know, is your paper on American literature. The text that we will be doing today is a poem by Anne Bradstreet. And the title of the poem is To My Dear and Loving Husband. You do know some American poets, of course you do. You've heard of Walt Whitman, you've probably heard of Robert Frost, T.S. Eliot, both American and British. You've heard of Emily Dickinson. In fact, one of her poems is prescribed for you. Now, Anne Bradstreet is not such a well-known poet, is not such a popular poet, but that doesn't make her any the less important. She was born and wrote in the 17th century. The actual dates: she was born in 1628 and died in 1672. If we look at the period, it was in many ways puritanical, the Puritan period in England. And she is an American poet, but remember, the ties between England and America of those days was indeed very close. Now, Anne Bradstreet was born into a reasonably well-off family. Her father was well educated. They believed in the Elizabethan tradition of educating girls, and so education was very important. However, she did not go to school, but was educated by her father at home, but educated in such a way that she had a good grounding even in classical literature. Remember, in those days, it was very important to read Greek and to know the Latin language and to read a lot of literature of those times, what we call classical literature. Well, coming to her poetry, she did write a lot of poetry and some personal pieces also, which were published posthumously. But the book that we are talking about is called The Tenth Muse, Lately Sprung Up in America. Quite a longish name. The Tenth Muse, Lately Sprung Up in America. And interestingly, it was published in 1650 in London. Once she got married, she moved from this kind of a life into what is called the New England, right? A kind of wilderness. She moved there. Initially, she found it difficult to adjust, but she had a good family life. She was very much in love with her husband. She believed in marital love, and she had 8 children. The poem that we are going to be looking at today is called To My Dear and Loving Husband. Let me read it out to you. If ever two were one, then surely we. If ever man were loved by wife, then thee. If ever wife was happy in a man, compare with me, ye women, if you can. I prize thy love more than whole mines of gold, of all the riches that the East doth hold. My love is such that rivers cannot quench, nor aught but love from thee give recompense. Thy love is such as I can in no way repay. The heavens reward thee manifold, I pray. Then while we live in love, let's so preserve, let's so persevere, that when we live no more, we may live ever. If you did look at the poem on your screen, you would have noticed that at one glance, it might seem as if it were a sonnet, because the length of the poem, at one glance, I say, remember. But once you do count the lines, you will realize that it is not a sonnet. It sounds like a sonnet. In fact, it does sound like a Shakespearean sonnet in the way the idea develops and then what happens in the last two lines. But do count the lines and you would realize that it is 12 lines, not 14 lines, and therefore it cannot be a sonnet. The poem is considered to be, in many ways, a celebration of love in marriage. And I read somewhere that it is supposed to be one of the poems that is sung even when a couple take the marriage vows, because it does celebrate marital love. We are talking of the Puritan age, and therefore the love of God was very important. So is there in any way a conflict between love for your partner, love for your spouse, and love for the God, for the Almighty? No, certainly not. Because as we go along with the poem, you will realize how the poet is so easily or beautifully, aesthetically able to combine the love for her partner into a kind of divine love, because love after death. I'll come to that when we come to the end of the poem. So let's begin reading the poem, looking at the poem in detail, and she says, if ever two were one, then surely we. We might be two in body, physically two, but we are so united that we are one. So if I do need to give an example of two being one, well, the best example is you and me, she's telling her husband. If ever man were loved by wife, then thee. I'm looking for an example where a man is loved very much by his wife. Oh, well, if I'm looking for an example, then you are the best example, because you're so loved by your wife. She's talking about herself, of course, that I love you so much. But it's not just you being loved by me. She goes on to, if ever wife was happy in a man, compare with me, you women. E, Y-E is the old English for you, if you can. So she's looking at the other women around her and saying, oh, you're trying to see whether women are really happy in marriage. You're looking to see which woman is really happy in marriage. Look at me. I am the best example. Oh, you women, you're looking around for a woman who's happy with her man, who's happy in marriage, who thinks of marital bliss. Then of course it has to be me. I am the best example of that. Remember, I just spoke about the Elizabethan ideals. So the America that we are looking at now, when Anne Bradstreet was writing, is certainly an America which was influenced by the rule of Queen Elizabeth. And students of literature, you have certainly done the Elizabethan age, you've done Shakespeare, you've done other poets, you've done the university wits, and when we look at all of them, we know the golden age of Queen Elizabeth I. That was the age when also they set out in ships to the east, to the land of silks and spices, to India and the east. So she says, if I were to say how much I love you more than all the treasures of the East, than all the gold of the East. Because in those days, the East, for Europe, for England in particular, East was the land, the world of plenty. So I would love you, I do love you much more than all the gold of the East. I have a kind of unquenchable love. critics have pointed out maybe there is a sexual imagery in that, but I'm not going into that. But I have a kind of love for you which is unquenchable. You love me too, and I don't think I can ever repay that love. I can't. I can't repay your love. And as I mentioned to you, almost like a sonnet, the last two lines, but I'm at the third last line, where she says, I hope for all the love that we hold for each other, you will be rewarded even in an afterlife. Even the heavens should reward you, she says. And so the last two lines of the poem, she says, our love is so much, is so great, is almost so divine, is so unquenchable, that I think even after death, we will continue to love each other just as much. Then while we live in love, let's so persevere that when we live no more, we may live ever. Our love continues to be just the same. A real celebration of love in marriage, but not in any way in conflict with love for the God. Some of you, my dear students, might remember Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poem, How Do I Love Thee? Let Me Count the Ways. If you don't remember, do go back and read that poem. There too, it is a poet, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, talking about her love for her husband, who was the great Victorian poet, Robert Browning, if you remember. Anyway, so to come back to this poem, I think the poem is quite simple. You would have understood it. Very simple questions, of course. In a poem, you could have what does the metaphors that she has, the comparisons that she has. So to what does the poet compare her love? You could look at a question like that. How is her love special? How is her love different? So you have her comparing it, asking other women to look at who is loved so much. You could have a short question on the last two lines of the poem, where she talks about how their love will continue even after their death. Read the poem again, read the poem aloud, look at the questions on your website, and I hope you enjoy listening to this lecture and many more which we teachers of English are putting together for all of you. All the best.